Hello, welcome to the Path 11 podcast. I am your host, April Hanna. I am also the co-founder of Path 11 Productions, and aside from podcasting, we also make great films and documentaries, which can be found at path11productions.com. We have a special promo code just for our podcast listeners. The promo code is Path11Podcast, and if you go to our website, path11productions.com, and visit our shop page, put that promo code in, and you will receive 50% off of our Evolution DVD, which is the third film in our Path Trilogy series. If you would like to become a sponsor of the Path 11 podcast, please email me at info@path11productions.com. And now for this week's show. So today I am joined with Joe Mancini, and I would really recommend that you guys check out the show notes of his full bio. This man has done incredible work, has studied some amazing things, and it would probably take us about maybe 10 minutes to read the whole thing. So I'm going to give you the shortened version. But so Joe received a Ph.D. in English and American Literature from Harvard, an M.S.W. from the University of Maryland, and a B.A. in English from Providence College. He is a practitioner of Neuro-Linguistic programming and a certified clinical hypnotherapist. He has his own practice in transpersonal and spiritual counseling in Maryland and has also published the book, The Present Power of Past Lives, The Experts Speak. Now, on today's show, we are going to be talking to Joe about his newest book called Ending the Endless Conflict, Healing Narratives from Past-Life Regressions to the Civil War. And it was one of Joe's friends that actually recommended that we interview him, and that was Linda Baker, and we had interviewed her on the show called Soul Contracts. So welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So this is when we were talking to Linda, she said, hey, are you taking show suggestions? Are you still looking for people? And we're like, we're always looking for people. And she said, well, I have a really interesting friend who is doing some work with past life regression and the Civil War. And I said, wow, that sounds fascinating. So that's a little bit how we found you. Yes.
And Linda's just a sweetheart.
Yeah, she provided just such great knowledge. We had a great show with her as well. And so gosh, where do we even begin? I guess I'd like to talk a little bit and have you introduce our listeners to your background and your story and how you came to this point where you are right now and doing the work that you're doing with people.
In a way, all the things that you mentioned that I've done actually all come together to get me where I am today, because the analysis of the analytical skills that I learned as a reader of literature became very, very helpful when I became a traditional therapist and then later a hypnotherapist. So in terms of becoming a hypnotherapist, that's how I got here. As far as the book is concerned, The Regressions to the Civil War, in my preface, I talk about my own experience during the Vietnam War and basically some miracles that I believe saved my life. And when I left, I wondered why my life had been saved. And I decided to dedicate my life to helping other people. And even though I did a lot of that, something was still missing. And it wasn't until about 2.5 years ago that I went up to Gettysburg with a friend and actually visited the battlefields for the first time, and was stricken with horror to see all of what look like tombstones. They're actually regimental markers. And I started reading a bit about the Civil War and the slaughter. The estimates are between 620 and 720,000 deaths, which would be the equivalent of about 2.5 million people today. In terms of the percentage of population. And I just realized that I'm a hypnotherapist, I can do past-life regressions, and perhaps I can do some healing work, not only for the people here and now, but for their past life selves. So that's basically, and I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's basically how we got here.
Right. And you kind of also open up your book with a really fascinating story with a woman that you had dated.
Yes.
That on, the outside, looking in and reading, you could think, oh my God, this was wild and crazy. And was she experiencing delusions and psychosis and what's going on? So you have to tell that story because, it really is kind of a good introduction into the whole book and, part of one of the reasons too, why you began exploring this as well.
Right. Well, I met this woman about, I can't remember exactly, about 35 years ago. And I was a literature professor at the University of Maryland. And I was just beginning my spiritual exploration. And I had kind of heard of past lives, but didn't know really much about it. And so I smile every time I think about this. So when we met, I was not sure that she was the right fit for me for a lot of reasons, but she was fascinating because she seemed to be psychic. So one morning at 2 a.m., I get this call, and the voice is a woman's voice with a Southern accent. And I'm puzzled. And she says, Jason, I need you to ride down here. Come see me right away. So I suddenly realized it was this woman. And I got in my car, not my horse, and got down there in a half an hour. And when I got there, she opened the door. She was in this kind of filmy negligee. And it could have been something from a long time ago. And I knew something was off. And today I would say she was in a trance. And we went to the bedroom, made love, and then she was talking to me, calling me Jason. And I was trying to figure out what this was about. And finally I figured out that this was Civil War talk. And that suddenly we were in two worlds at once. The next morning, she acted as though nothing had happened. And I, strangely enough, because I'm a very curious person, just let it go. Well, a short time later, we went to Cape May, and it was evening, dark, and we were walking along the street that have those Victorian mansions. And she suddenly stopped and put her ear against one of the wooden pillars at the beginning of the semicircular driveway. And I asked her what she was doing, and she said, she shushed me, said, be quiet. I'm hearing horses snorting, I'm hearing wagons creaking, I'm hearing people. And suddenly I realized we're back in the Civil War. And again, I'm not sure, as you suggested earlier, whether she was having delusions or whatever. But she wanted to go on the grounds, and I pulled her away. And we went back to the hotel where, again, she was calling me Jason, and I realized that she liked Jason more than she liked me. So I ended that relationship. But a year and a half ago, and I lost all contact with her. About a year ago, a psychic that I talk to fairly regularly, to make a long story short, she told me that this woman was my paramour during the Civil War, and that I was a quartermaster in the Confederate Army. I lived in Maryland, and she lived in New Jersey. And we had a very kind of fractious relationship, made worse by the war. I did survive the war. I came back. We got married, and it was very tumultuous. So that was very striking. That I found out about a Civil War connection long, long before I became a therapist or even a hypnotherapist, and before I really knew much about past lives.
Right. So I'm sure you were, throughout the years, you've probably been piecing parts of that experience together. And
Yes.
getting a
Yes.
little more clarity. Yeah.
Right. And she wasn't crazy. I mean, in retrospect, I know she wasn't crazy. She just was kind of undisciplined in the way she could access alternate reality.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And, with you saying the number that you had mentioned earlier about how many people had perished and died in the Civil War, I'm sure that you find that there are many people that have in this lifetime or feel very much of a connection to this period in time.
Yes, especially where I'm living now. I'm in Frederick, Maryland. Gettysburg is about 32 miles away. Antietam, where the bloodiest one-day battle ever in American history occurred, that's only about 30 miles away. And there was a battle about 5 miles from my house in Frederick. And so this is there's a lot of ghosts here.
Yeah.
Literally.
Well, and I'd like to take our listeners on a little bit more of a crazy journey with this conversation and to talk a little bit about how, there is that possibility that the past and parallel lives and future lives are all happening at the same time, and wrapping our minds around that. And you also referenced to Jane Roberts in the book Seth Speaks.
Yes.
And many people I know are familiar with that, but I'd like to kind of start there and talk a little bit about the multidimensional nature of the psyche according to Seth. And then you broke it down so well in your book about describing the different ways in which the soul is existing.
Yes. Well, let me address first what you mentioned about all of these, what I call alternate selves of the soul, all exist at once. Beyond this time-space reality, and even modern physics agrees with this, there is what is called the spacious present. There's no time. So everything and everyone who has ever existed are all existing now in that spacious present. And only when we start thinking about those selves in the time-space continuum do we put some in the present, some in the future, and some in the past. And what's important about this notion that these are all simultaneously living selves is that despite let me put it a different way. When we do a past life regression, it always ends with the death of the past life self. And so it would seem that life has ended. It's set in stone. But in reality, that life only seems set in stone because we're thinking about it in terms of the time-space continuum. In effect, none of these lives are finished. A certain ending to a particular past life helps us understand some relevance between that past life and the present lifetime. But we can change these past lives. We can change the endings of them because they're not finished. And in my book, in one of the stories, the one with Jude, who's the present day self, and James Matthews, who's the past life self. I have Jude come back after the past life regression and go back into that life and offer James Matthews a different way to end his life, which had been quite tragic. And I deliberately did that so that my readers could see how even a past life could change. Depending on the choice of the past life self. Nobody can force anybody to do anything. It's all based on choice. So I could go anywhere from this point on.
Yeah. The other thing that I really found fascinating too, when you're talking about going back and, either changing how you died in a past life, is that when a new past is chosen, all the people involved with that individual are also telepathically informed and have the choice to be or not be in the individual's new past.
That's right. And the thing that we don't understand, I'm talking here about conscious choice, but we're making these changes all the time on the subconscious level, but we don't know that we're doing that, okay? So we're changing our own pasts probably quite often, and the people who are with us are changing those paths. And if someone isn't with us in the parallel reality that we then create, we wouldn't even know it. We wouldn't have a memory of that person. And yet, again, nothing is ever lost. No one is ever lost. We have access through trance, through the dream state. We have access to all of our parallel lives, all of our alternate selves. Nothing is ever lost. We confuse something being lost with not being in consciousness, okay? Just because we're not conscious of something doesn't mean that something is gone and lost. And I want to say that to reassure people that we've not lost anything. And we can reconnect, and I think merge again with a parallel life that we left. The multidimensionality of the soul is beyond comprehension. And we really can't wrap our minds around how multiple we are. And let me just say, one of the reasons why this is very important to know. One of the main problems I talk about in the book, that is the root of conflict and war, is our stereotyping of ourselves and others. And one of the ways we stereotype ourselves and others is to reduce our sense of our own complexity and the complexity of others. We see ourselves as sort of like having one voice. And the truth of the matter is we have many, many, many voices, not only from parts of ourselves, what we call subpersonalities, which most psychologies are familiar with, but also the voices of our alternate selves, our past life selves, our counterpart selves, our future selves, and all of that. And if we have access and choose to have access to those alternate selves, then we have many more perspectives, and we see how much more complex a response we can give to the world. And so to me, that's the main reason why it's really important to know how multidimensional we are. We have many resources within us, not just one or two. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It's so much to digest, though. When I was reading all of this, of course, I was like, okay, let me go into my parallel self. When you talk about the parallel or the probable selves, that those are they're very much like our present selves, but it's all the different paths that we didn't take in this lifetime that are still playing out. And then I was thinking about, so I wonder if I did take that path, what would that look like? And then I started to go into the energy of that. I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And then if you saw my notes, when I got to counterpart selves, in big letters, I have "say what?"
Yeah.
This blew me away. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well, because it reminded me when people say, oh, I've seen your doppelganger, or, maybe that there's somebody that seems a lot like you, but you also talked about how we can kind of be different ages in different places of the world.
Okay.
And whoa, mind blowing. Okay.
I'm glad you mentioned this, because I also have a couple of examples I can give you with this. This is a notion that was promulgated by Jane Roberts Seth. And the idea is that the soul, when it wants to know something from many points of view all at once, it incarnates 4 to 5 personalities around the same time period. They may be of different ages, but their lives in terms of time, overlap. Okay, so you may have a 10-year-old in one country is obese, and let's say it's a male, and there may be a female in China who is almost anorexic, and she's let's say she's 15 or something like that. And then there may be a researcher, a female in England, who's trying to come up with a weight reduction pill, and she's in her 50s. So you can see what I'm saying. All of these personalities are basically working on the same issue, but from different points of view. And each one of these personalities has access to all the other counterpart selves during the dream state and also in trance. I developed a protocol to be able to access them. And they can get information from each other. They share information. Again, a lot of this is done on the subconscious level. You may never meet your counterpart selves. On the other hand, you may be married to one of your counterpart selves. And I think that wartime is an especially important time for many souls because of the stresses and strains and the challenges are very multiple during a wartime. So I think the counterpart self phenomenon would be really prevalent during war. Now, this also accounts for another phenomenon that I think is very important. A number of people who came to me for the past life regressions, for the Civil War ones, told me that, for instance, they were very interested in the domestic details of that time. So the idea they had in their minds was, oh, well, I'll be almost surely my past life self will be that of a woman who takes care of the home front. Well, in almost every case, that didn't happen. In fact, what the person was a combat soldier, much to the horror of the present day individual. And so how do we account for the present day individual's thought, oh, I probably was a domestic, but I turned out to be a combat soldier? The counterpart self phenomenon makes sense of that. Indeed, the person probably was a domestic as well as a combat soldier. They were counterpart selves during that time. And in fact, in one of the stories, the woman who's living now came to see me for a different past life regression. And when she went to another scene in that particular past life, she didn't stay in that past life. She went to another past life, and it happened to be during the Civil War. And she was a scout in a surveillance balloon, which I didn't know existed at the time, but the North and the South each had a corps of balloons. They used them for surveillance. They could see the battlefield better from up high. And so when she came to do the past life regression to the Civil War, we expected her to go back to that past life self who was in the balloon. Well, she didn't do that. What happened was she was a scout on the ground. And so we explained that, again, in terms of counterpart selves. The soul wanted to learn about observation from different points of view, from up close and from far away being the balloon, and up close being on the ground. So that makes sense of people thinking they were certain kinds of people and finding out, oh, well, we don't seem to be that. Well, in fact, you were both. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's also a great example to show how when you're doing regression work, the conscious mind is not in charge. Because, here you guys are thinking, oh, maybe we'll go back to this part, and then it takes a totally different turn, and, the unconscious mind soul goes where it needs to go.
Right. I in the induction, I honor the conscious mind, but ask it to simply observe. Because without the conscious mind being with us when we do the regression, you won't remember anything. So it's simply an observer and a recorder of the experience. So we don't want to get rid of the conscious mind. We just want to put it in the place it needs to be while we're doing the regression.
Great. So now let's kind of move a little bit more towards the book. So you were going through this investigation of the Civil War, and you collected a total of 17 individuals to participate in this book that you wrote, and you did regression work. So can you explain how you found the people to do the regression work with, and why you chose the 17 individuals that you did?
Okay. I would actually say that spirit chose them. And the reason I say that is that I wasn't sure how to gather people. As I said earlier, I live in an area where there was a tremendous Civil War activity. And oftentimes people from past lives come back to the places they lived in during the past life. So what I thought to myself, how am I going to find these people? I had two criteria. One was that anyone who would come for a regression had to have an interest in the Civil War, possibly a positive interest. And this other criteria was just the opposite, that if you actively, was distressed by or hated the war, you were also a candidate for it. So that was the quote-unquote test that the prospective client had to pass in order for me to even consider doing the regression, because we couldn't know otherwise. It was a good guess if they were really interested, deeply interested, or deeply repulsed. And many of the stories in the book, these people don't know each other. When I tell the story of their present-day selves, you'll see there are a lot of similarities in the way they were often repulsed by even walking on the battlefields. So I first of all queried my contact list of former clients. I sent out flyers to my other list with people who had come and been on the email list and wanted to be on the email list. I asked word of mouth to be, people tell their friends, etc. And surely as I didn't imagine was going to happen, they came. And they didn't all come at once, which was a good thing, because it takes, one of these sessions would take 4 to 5 hours.
Wow.
That doesn't mean the longest anyone was in trance was 2.5 hours. But I spent a good deal of time doing an intake interview, because I need to know, in terms of healing, I need to know what's going on in the present day self in order to bring the fruits of the past life regression to bear on the present day. And what was interesting was, of the 17 people, 14 of them were women, and only 3 were men. There was one African-American man. I wished that I had even more variety, but there was more variety in the past life selves. There were women, but a lot of the present day women were combat soldiers, sometimes willing, sometimes not. And the section that I call On the Home Front, Women on the Home Front, contains 5 stories of the horrors that women went through, both in the North and especially in the South, being on the home front. And that's especially true because later in the war, the Northern General Sherman and another Northern General Sheridan practiced what's called hard war, which is devastating war. They go after the civilian lands and they decimate them to deny the Southern soldiers of sustenance. And it wreaked havoc for about 100 years in the South. So this hard war doctrine was very, very hard on the women who were there. So again, I need your guidance to go, because I could go where I could talk forever about this.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I'd like you to, obviously, we're not going to be able to talk about all 17, regressions, because we want everybody to go out there and read this book and learn about these, regressions. But one of the questions that I have is, what did you notice in all the individuals after they went through the regression, how they were able to take that information and heal a part of themselves today?
All right. Well, this is a very, very good question, because the way I organized each chapter or each case study was there was an account of the history of the present day individual, then the account of the past life self, and then the third section I label the potential for healing. And I was very careful in that wording, because as I say in the book, with this work, I can show people very clearly where healing might occur if they do certain things, if they look at certain things. But the old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. It's always about choice. You can go through an experience like this and choose, for whatever reasons, not to take the fruit of it and use it. I will say this, that every participant was blown away by the experience and was very thankful at the end. And some of these people really took what they learned and started to incorporate these learnings into their lives. And the learnings basically were the past life self either showed the present day self what not to do, or what to do, or some combination of both of them. And I also say sometimes additional work is done. The person I mentioned earlier who went back to his past life self and offered that self a different way to die, well, that present day self, we called him Jude, felt like a slave in this life, and he was a slave back in that life, and was often beset by depression, and would go and lay down and on his bed and would just be in a funk for a long time. He was also very pressured by his father to meet his father's expectations of what he ought to do. And Jude really wanted to do spiritual work, but he was very depressed. And he found that his past life self was in a similar situation. And after he came out of the regression, and it's quite beautiful, the account of that, he resolved that he was not going to lie down, that he was not going to listen to other people's expectations of him. And he has really flourished with his Reiki practice. He's really done a great job. And so the whole experience impacted him quite a great deal. Another person, and I believe this is the next to the last case study, I call it a dying soldier. And it's an incredible accounting of a soldier who is slowly dying of a wound, a major wound to the chest. And the present day self had, I think it calls her Lydia, the present day self had suffered the suicide death of a close friend of hers. And this had deeply demoralized her. And during the regression, and there was more to it just than that she was dying, but in the process of experiencing the soldier's dying moments, she realized that the death of this soldier, who had been, as I said, brutally killed, or wounded rather, that death was not that horrible an experience, and because the soldier felt a peace come over him before he actually died. And so when the present day self came out of the regression, she felt much, much better about the death the suicide death of her friend. It had relieved her of that sense of horror, because she actually, in a sense, went through a death where she was wounded in the same way, not the same way, but in the same area where her friend had killed himself. So sometimes there are immediate effects. Sometimes there's long-term effects if the person in the present day heeds what he or she learned from the past life.
Right. Great. Thank you for sharing those stories. You actually, I was going to ask you, can you share a couple? And you already did. So wonderful. Another question too is, I always find it fascinating how there are present day war reenactors.
Yes.
And, people who get together and reenact this stuff, and, they're like long weekend things. So, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I actually have a short chapter. I say short because the others are a lot longer. A short chapter at the end of the book. I think I call it The Mutual Mirroring of Yesterday and Today. And it's about reenacting. And one of the things, I didn't interact a lot with reenactors. There is one person in the book, a woman, who is a present-day reenactor. And I tried to engage some others that I met. I went to a couple of reenactments, tried to engage them. And, of course, my sample was very, very small. But I kind of generalized that a lot of reenactors are not all that interested in something like past-life regression, though you would think they would be. And especially since when they're reenacting a battle, a couple of them told me, and I also read about this, they would have what was termed a wargasm, meaning they would have an experience where they didn't know what century they were in. In effect, they were having a regression. And I make the point in the book that past life regression is a very intense reenactment experience, much more personal, and I think ultimately much more powerful. And I think a lot of the reenactors are people who lived during the Civil War and are repeating, almost like with a repetition compulsion, what they went through. But they never come to resolution. Now, I want to be careful, especially if any reenactors happen to hear this. I have great admiration for the living history that they present. We need that living history. We don't want to forget what happened. We need to see people reenacting. And yet, I think there's a dimension of this that is like what Freud called a repetition compulsion, where you keep repeating and repeating, but you get no resolution. And that's not what happens in past life regression. So I didn't get very involved at all with reenacting, but because it didn't go where I was wanting to go with this. And again, I want to repeat, I find the presence of reenacting a very, very vital thing for our sense of history, and for ourselves as adults, but also for our children. So I don't want to cast aspersions on it. I'm just saying in terms of the contrast between that kind of reenacting and the reenacting that happens in past life regression, there's a significant difference. I even proposed in the book a kind of mega healing experience through some group past life regressions of the Civil War. I don't know if I'm going to do that, but I presented it as a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind for me with the reenactment and, the repetition of it, even from an energetic sense, is does it keep that energy stuck? Yeah,
that's exactly what I was saying. Yes, that concerns me. I think you could do a past life regression and get unstuck and still do reenacting, but with a different mindset. So the past life regression is not an attempt to get rid of reenacting in the conventional sense. It's to get rid of, as we say, the stuckness. In a way, I think some of these reenactors are like living ghosts, because there are a lot of people have seen bands of soldiers on the battlefield who are ghosts. And, these are flesh and blood ghosts in some instances. I wouldn't say all. And I have been to Gettysburg countless times, and I've always hoped that I would see one, but I don't.
Wouldn't it be an interesting proposal if you could get some of the reenactments all over the world to choose a different outcome like you do in past life regression, and monitor that over time and see if in fact there is a change in war throughout our history, because they say history repeats itself, right?
Absolutely. And I think, I can't imagine the logistics of that, but boy, I would want to be a part of that. Absolutely.
And I think that would be fascinating. However, it would really challenge people to say, because I could see where people would get very stuck on, we can't change the history of this, and this is what we're created, and why would we reenact something different? But if you could get enough people to buy into the fact of energy and shifting that, and shifting the outcome, and bringing about more peace, less slaughter, less deaths, what that would do.
It would be a form of prayer, very potent prayer. And, that sort of thing just stokes me. Feel passion coming up, but I haven't any idea how that would happen, because there's so many obstacles, not even so much logistical obstacles in terms of, physical problems, but in terms of changing people's minds. And I wrote this book. The way it turned out is not the way I expected it to turn out. I was just going to do some past life regressions to the Civil War and see I could, do that, provide some healing. But it took on a life of its own. And that's why, in the introduction and in the postscript, I talk about how the polarizations and the stereotyping that began even before the Civil War are still with us today. And so it's a very timely book in that regard, but it's also, I think, timeless. And, maybe I've had this fantasy. I don't know how I could do it, but I would love to get this book to Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg and see if they could do a movie with this that has to do with the present day selves and the past lives. And, something like that could spark something like what you said. But I'm just putting that out in case it sparks something somewhere and someone contacts me and all of that. Because I believe that the work that this book started is over. I think it's just beginning, or at least I hope so.
Yeah, and that was going to be my last question as we wrap up. Do you feel like your work with the Civil War and past life regression is over, or is this just the catalyst to, bring you into something new? The honest answer to that is I don't know. But I can tell you that, as I kind of mentioned a moment ago, as we're talking about this, I can feel the juices starting to run again. I just don't know where. I don't know what the next step is. But the first step is for people, like you, to read the book, because my heart and soul is in it. And I think that if other people, their hearts and souls are touched by the book, then slowly but surely something more will happen. And again, would love to be a part of it. Absolutely.
It happens.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. This was a really great interview. And you also have 2 websites if people are interested in contacting you. You have lifetransforminghypnotherapy.com and also explorationsinspirit.com. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about each website and what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Okay. The best way to get in touch with me is through email. And should I just give that?
Sure, yes.
All right. It's SOULSRV as in Victor, R at EROLS.com. I'll say it again. SOULSRVR at EROLS.com. The Life Transforming Hypnotherapy is my website. There's a lot on there. A lot of the modalities that are possible through hypnotherapy are listed. It's a large website. The other one, Explorations in Spirit, is a blog. I don't write much on it now, partly because I've been writing these books. But there's some really, I think, interesting essays that I write that they're not short, that are based on the Seth material, Jane Roberts Seth material. So, I'd be happy to hear from anybody who's interested in, exploring who they are, which is, again, as I said, you're a multidimensional being beyond your imagining.
Absolutely. And I would like our listeners to just take maybe a small little moment of silence and send those energy waves and thoughts out there to Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks to make your request happen and, just to move that momentum forward. So I do hope that happens for you. I do hope that, maybe we're planting a little bit of a seed for new reenactments to happen. Who knows what it'll turn out to be. But thanks so much, Joe. I really enjoyed you bringing this topic onto our podcast.
And April, I can't thank you enough. It's such a delight to have someone interested in the book and what's in it. And thank you so much.
If you want more information about our films, visit our website, path11productions.com, to purchase DVDs or to rent and stream each film. You can also find our trilogy of films on iTunes, Amazon Prime, and Gaia.com. You can still use our smartphone app for both Android and iPhones. Just search for Path 11 in the Google Play App Store, or if on an iPhone, look for Path 11 in the iOS App Store. Catch you next time.